Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you're all here today on this Wednesday, June 21st. I hope everybody's doing well. Glad to see some of you back from previous days. I see some names and faces that are familiar to me. So happy to have you all back today. All right, so let's get started here. We are focusing today on data. Okay, we've had quite a journey so far. We began with looking at some of the foundational terminology in our first session. Yesterday, we talked about ACEs, and I thought we had a wonderful conversation about ACEs. I hope folks are continuing to think about how we can really integrate and think of ACEs. I do believe the conversation on data is truly foundational. It helps us understand what disparities exist and what equities exist in the communities we serve. So before we get started here, I always like to get us warmed up on Minty Meter. So this is the tool that I use here to engage and have more interaction. There's a couple ways you can do this. If you get the camera from your phone and show that QR code to your camera, it'll drop you into the Minty Meter presentation. You also can just open up a browser in your computer if you're on a laptop, go to minty.com. It's going to ask you for the code that's there. And so this first one, I thought it might be curious to who would be someone you would invite to dinner. And they could be living, dead, whoever you desire. Who would you invite to dinner? And there's a few options. If you have a couple people you're thinking about, go ahead and put anyone there on the list. And all you do is press submit at the bottom of there, and it's going to pull up a really cool graphic here of all the different people that folks are saying they might like to have dinner with. I was just watching a documentary. I was like, oh, I would love to spend some time with this person. Okay, so let's see here what comes up. Okay, we got some things coming up. This is great. Wow. Ooh. Very interesting. So if you guys know anything about word clouds, when a name is bigger, that means more than one person has actually chosen that name. So Robin Williams, look at that. More than one person has chosen that person's name, which is kind of interesting. At the same time, we don't have a whole lot of repeats. So Lady Gaga, that's a good one. Bob Seger, John Lennon. Ooh, man, I'd like to have a group dinner and invite some of these folks to a group dinner. Fabulous. Okay. So I think people are warmed up. Mentimeter is a platform we'll use throughout. Okay. You only have to do this once, but of course, if you miss it, no worries. I'll bring it up again. I have a few times where you can share your thoughts. This is just a great way to allow some passive activity and interaction throughout our time together. Okay. So if you have been with me the last couple of days, you know, I start every session the same way by centering us into the topic of today. And again, the reason I do this is because unlike before the pandemic, where you knew you probably had a 10 or 15-minute grace between one meeting ending because you had to leave your office to go to the next, in the Zoom world, some of you probably came here right on the end of another meeting, okay? And you may have another meeting right after this. And as a result of that, I think sometimes we go into meeting spaces carrying I call it the baggage from the previous meeting. So I use this activity as an opportunity to really kind of clear our minds for our conversation and time together. So I'll ask everyone to grab a piece of paper. If this is your first time here, you grab a piece of paper. You're going to make 4 quadrants on your paper, okay? This is what we're going to use to do a little bit of short writing exercise. The first thing that I'll have you do, I'm going to set a timer for just 45 seconds of time. And in this time, what I'm going to have you do is at the center of your paper, you're going to draw the tightest little spiral there in the center for just 45 seconds of time. Okay. Make sure you're breathing. Be intentional to not hold your breath. Okay. All right, so our first question in the top left corner. When you think about data, what comes to mind? When you think about data, what comes to mind? Alrighty, our second question in the top right corner. What fears do you have about working with data? What fears do you have about working with data? Okay. Our third question in your bottom left corner. What do you believe is our biggest potential for change? What do you believe is our biggest potential for change? And then the final question here on the last box is, what are you hoping to get from today's workshop? Just curious what made you log into this particular workshop today. What are you hoping to get? Okay, wonderful. All right, so today I have three main objectives in our time. First, I want to really kind of center us around understanding the power of data for good, but also for amplifying bias. I want to talk about what data literacy is and why I think it's so critical that we should be good data consumers. And then lastly, I'm going to leave you all with a tool on how to be equity focused when you're doing a needs assessment. Okay. So the first objective, the power of data, and I love this quote. It says, data are just summaries of thousands of stories. Tell a few of those stories to help make the data meaningful. And this is so powerful to me because I think about how often we use data and how data sometimes feels impersonal. But we've got to really remember that every data point is a person, is someone's cousin, brother, mother, sister, right? All the roles that any of us play. And each data point tells a story. There are two things I kind of think about with data, the equity side and the justice side of data. And really kind of thinking and considering what do we mean when we say data equity versus data justice? And so I want to define those two terms for you all today. And let me just check, are folks being able to see my slides okay? Wanted to make sure, okay, because I know there was a concern a little bit earlier. Fabulous, okay. So when we say equity around data, we're really attempting to think about all the ways in which data is collected, what considerations do we need to have around how it's actually gathered, how people are then analyzing and making judgments about what the data says is really, really important. And then, of course, how we actually are distributing our data gathering resources, recognizing that collecting data requires money, finances, and resources. If you think about some of the things we talked about with equity being connected to economics, that it's no wonder there are some communities that are negatively impacted by data, and some communities that take data and are able to use that and gather more resources to themselves. And so we really want to think about how data can be used to reinforce stereotypes, exacerbate problems, create bias, and really undermine social justice. And so we really have to be thinking about how data is used in a way. And as we get through the content today, I'm hoping that you'll really see the lens that we can take, and some of the lenses we've taken for a long time that really perpetuate bias, unfortunately. When we're talking on the justice side, this is really thinking about, once we've gathered our data, what are we doing with it? Right? How are we protecting the privacy of the people who the stories and the data points reflect? But also, how are we using that information in decision making? Okay, because data creates power, it amplifies privilege, right? Because with the right data, you can command resources, whether they're financial resources or human resources, to make changes in a community. So we really have to be thinking about that particular side of how data is actually used once it's gathered in an equitable way, because just gathering it in an equitable way is not enough. We got to think about the justice side of the conversation. There's a quote I want to share with you all that I think amplifies what I'm just talking about here, which is this. It says, right or wrong, research drives decisions. If we do not address the power dynamics in the creation of research, at best, we're driving decision-making from partial truths. At worst, we are generating inaccurate information that ultimately does more harm than good in our communities. This is why we must care about how research is created. Okay. And so this is just a powerful tool to think about. When I think about how wonderful data can be, one of the things I've struggled with professionally is the fact that how you collect data, equity, justice, these are not topics that were taught to me at all. In my background in public health, and I don't even think I had conversations like this on the job. So when I'm very, very happy that we're in a place where we're even having conversations like this today, where we're really given the chance to think about our data and our research methods that we're using. This is something that's so important to think about, you all, because unfortunately, just like we've talked about there being a history of trauma related to how people were treated, has been a part of the history of data too. There are multiple communities who have experienced really bad things, injustices as it comes to being researched. And so we've got to have that in the back of your minds as to why some communities don't want anything to do with research, don't want anything to do with data. Yet if you really think about it, we need that type of information and collaboration to really create some community change. It's got to be data driven. If you remember yesterday, for those who were here, I shared the two trees. One was barren, one was fruitful. And the reason that they were that way is because of the the social inequality in a community. In order to know what the social inequality is, you have to collect data, right? And so we've got to be doing things in an equitable and justice way, because it helps us uncover what's happening in a community so that we can then allocate resources appropriately. So let's start by talking about the power of data. And the good things that data can do, they can quantify, which is count, and qualify, which is to describe disparities that are happening in a community. And this is a really critical thing, because remember, disparities are preventable differences in health outcomes. So we want to be able to use data to understand what they are, because if they're preventable, we want to make changes there. That's, to me, the low-hanging fruit in society. At the same time, disparities show us what's wrong. So I think the power side of this is that once we know what the disparities are, we also get to count and describe our opportunities for change, our opportunities for growth, and our opportunities for improvements in health for the communities we serve. Ultimately, you all, this is what leads to our ability to fuel policy action, advocacy, to create change, right? To really shift health outcomes for our communities. I think one of the best examples of this transition is what happened with tobacco and cigarettes. In the early days that it was around, I mean, you would see doctors prescribing cigarettes. If you've ever looked at that history, it was pretty profound. And look how long it took us to gather the data, collect the data, to find the disparities, to find the opportunity, but ultimately to fuel the policy changes that then came, so that now people don't smoke on airplanes or in hospitals or in restaurants, right? We've had huge, major policy changes and shifts that have had a positive impact on the way in which tobacco shows up in society. So data can be an extremely powerful tool that helps drive community change. I want to share an example from a community in New Jersey that used a platform called the City Health Dashboard. And I'd be curious if anyone in the room, you can use the thumbs up acronym if you, or the thumbs up reaction, if anyone has heard of City Health Dashboard before. This is a tool and resource that I came across here in the last year or so. And so I want to share an example from this a coalition who used this particular dashboard to really drive community change in their community. So make sure my sound is on.
I honestly think that without City Health Dashboard data, we would not have been able to produce the community health assessment that we were able to publish. The City of Clifton is one of the largest municipalities in the state of New Jersey. We are located in the New York metro area, 13 miles west of Manhattan. Clifton is one of the most diverse communities, not only in the state of New Jersey, but in the country as a whole. The most important documents that are required for accreditation are your community health assessment and your community health improvement plan. My health officer and I were so excited to hear of the City Health Dashboard because it had been such a struggle to find municipal level data for our community health assessment. And so when we found out that we were included in the project and that all of these indicators and measures were being collected for the City of Clifton, it was like striking gold. So we used almost every measure that City Health Dashboard had available at the time. However, we were especially interested in those measures that gave us census tract level data, such as children living in poverty, obesity, the uninsured rate, and those able to seek preventive services. The census tract level data with the color-coded maps are especially easy for someone to navigate the dashboard's website. We were really excited when we finally published our community health assessment because we were one of the few municipalities in the state of New Jersey to be able to produce such a robust assessment. We actually even submitted the assessment for an award to the League of Municipalities here in the state of New Jersey, and we won the award. for one of the best publications from a local health department. The data in the community health assessment was so compelling that it finally convinced our policymakers and decision makers to approve funding a satellite health office in an area of the city with great need. Definitely recommend City Health Dashboard to any community that is conducting any type of assessment.
Hey, now I'm not sure if any of you had ever heard of the City Health Dashboard before. I always share it as a resource. And if you do check it out, I did put the link in the chat. Just know this was a part of a large scale project. Not every city in the US is on this particular dashboard. What I've told communities who come across the website and their community isn't existing on there, I actually encourage folks to connect with your county health department. One, to see if you have an epidemiologist locally, because even if your city may not have a dashboard, there are metrics that you can get access to based upon that are similar to what they use here. So I'm just going to do let's see, I think I can pull this over. You all can see this. I just pulled over on my screen here. So I just wanted to show you all some of the metric options here. Some of the ones that relate to us specifically, opioid overdose are on here, smoking, binge drinking are here. And those are the substance related specific ones. But remember, when we're talking about the social determinants of health, it's really great to use a platform like this to gather other information, right? About income inequality. It might be very interesting to see what that looks like for the community you serve. Do you have a community that's highly segregated? What about walkability? Other things that might be a part of the social determinants that help you build a comprehensive picture of what's happening in your community. So I encourage y'all to check this out for thinking about how you can use and leverage data to truly examine what's happening in a community. Now, with power also comes burden. Okay, and responsibility. And so I think it's important to not only think about the good things the data can do, but some of the challenges around data. And one of the biggest challenges is how we actually collect information from people. This can be such a struggle where there's inequity, either because of differences in literacy levels of folks, making sure that you've actually thought about the literacy level of the community you're serving. Because there's nothing worse than someone taking a survey and they don't even understand what survey questions are asking. So really kind of thinking about the survey tools, also considering some communities may want a survey tool in a particular way versus another. There's been a lot of movement into the digital space of surveys that come on people's smartphones or other places or QR codes. And as much as I'm a huge fan of that technology, we have to really think about the community. Because if you're in a community where there's a low uptake of technology or internet's not the best, or not many people have smartphones, that's going to limit who actually takes your survey, which is connected to the next potential challenge, which is how do you make sure that you're getting a true representative sample, especially if you're going to be using the data to make broad statements about what's happening in your community. You want to make sure that you've looked at who responded to the survey and really deciding, can I use this data to make a decision about what's going to happen in a community? This is something that I think people struggle with sometimes, right? In that it takes a while to get the data. People are so excited to have the data they have that sometimes they overlook the fact that the data is not truly representative of the community. And then the last challenge when we're working with data is the fact that they tell stories. And sure, you collect the data, but then there's a process of analyzing and interpreting and then creating what you're going to say to people. And if we're not conscious of our own bias, then we look at data from a particular lens and we create and push a story and narrative out that amplifies bias. This is a really important thing to think about, that we should always be considering this when we're looking at data and the narrative. of what's happening, why something happened, to ask more questions so you really get to the root of the challenge. Okay. So for our second objective, I want to begin to identify what this concept of data literacy really means. And there's this really cool graphic here that helps us to understand that data literacy has three main pieces. There's how we read and interpret the data. There's components of how we work with data, and then how we communicate with data. And all three of these pieces are extremely important and critical. They come together to create the concept of data literacy. So first, when we're reading data, I think it's always important whenever you're looking at any piece of data to just have your brow raised just a bit, okay? Because there's always a bit of uncertainty in everything. And if you're reading data where people are speaking in absolutes and this is that, there's some bias there, okay? And so you want to just make sure that data can tell many stories. Take a minute to look at who are the people who are presenting the data in front of you. Who funds them, where they're coming from, is there any particular bias that's happening, so that when you're reading the data, you know that that's there. Now, someone who is presenting data from a place of ethics and justice, they will disclose their funding. They will disclose any sort of things that might color their perception or bias. That's how you know the person is coming from the right perspective. You want to look for that, right? Because we all have something we're wanting to get when we present data to a group of people. So you want to kind of think about that when you're reading data yourself. I want to share a video here that personally I really love. And so if you've not seen this before, I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. And the purpose and intention of this data, this particular video, is thinking about how we read data. And oftentimes, when we read a piece of data, sometimes we stop at the first question. And this video is really pressing us to think about, we should ask the why more than once. When you find out something's happening, ask why. Then ask why at least 2 or 3 more times so you can really get to the root. And I believe this particular video does a good job of showing, and it's a true story too. So I'm going to bring up the Minty to grab some thoughts from you all here. I have seen this video many times, you all, and every time that last sentence gets to me. How many airports have we moved because we stopped asking why? And this is something I think about in our prevention programming, because I truly wonder, how many times do we ask why? How often do we do that first needs assessment, that first YRBS? We gather the data and find out, oh, wow, 40% of the youth were doing XYZ. And we stop right there and run into planning. And so I think about how often have we forgotten to ask why, to dig deeper. When we're reading data, you all, we've got to ask more questions. And I love this video for expressing such a complex thought around data collection and reading data and gathering data. Wonderful. Thank you all for your comments here. Great and lighthearted. Yeah, it took a complex issue presented in a very simple, easy, plain language. Exactly. And so these are the things I think about, you all, when we're talking about data equity and justice, right? Because remember, our goals here are to create change and shifts in our community, which means we've got to be reading the data better. We've got to be digging deeper and asking more questions. Now I know what a Midgie is. I thought the same thing too. The other thing I found fascinating is the jobs. I was like, wait, there are pigeon and spider experts? How did I miss those job opportunities in school? Not that I would have wanted to been a spider expert, but I might not have minded being a pigeon expert. I didn't even know there was a need for that, but such is life. All right, so the other component is working with data. All right, because there's a part of literacy where we're taking someone else's data and reading through it and coming up with ideas and conclusions. And then there's a component of literacy that's all about how you work with data. Typically, there's two kinds of data that we collect. Either we get it from someone else, which is secondary data, or we collect it ourselves, which is primary. Now, oftentimes we do a lot of our work, you all, through secondary data. There are plenty of county and state data sources we use. I've mentioned YRBS as an acronym, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. There's an adult version one called BRFIS. There NISDA, all these acronyms of national data sets, which are all secondary data. Now, some of you may have some experience in whether it's a coalition or prevention agency where you all have created your own assessment tool, and that would be primary data, which is a little bit different. In general, when we're looking and working at data, there's the two types, and I mentioned this earlier. The qualitative data is data that's very descriptive. It uses words, quality, that sort of thing. Whereas the quantitative data is numbers and counts. How many people did XYZ? How many folks overdosed? How many people are binge drinking? How many people are using cannabis? That's your quantity data. We typically use all of these and all kinds from multiple types of data sources. Data sources, we really want to think about our sources in general. I know for me, because I do a lot of national work, so I use a lot of data that's coming from the national spaces. When I work with communities specifically, we're always thinking about, where are we getting our data from? If we're using surveys like Pride Survey, maybe you have a school district that has allowed Pride. Folks think about what are the questions that are going to be in that data set. So we know that our sources are right and well. The one thing that I do want to mention about working with data, and it's this concept called disaggregating data. And essentially what this means is a lot of times when we collect data, we group people together. And if you're working with an evaluator or an epidemiologist, there's been some thought into how the data is grouped together. And unfortunately, sometimes when we do this, it doesn't really help us to see some of the nuances and differences and challenges that particular populations of people may be experiencing. So this quote here comes from the Anna E. Casey Foundation. I encourage you all to check them out. They have wonderful resources around data collection, equity. But the quote says, the kind of data collected matters and can help unearth a problem masked by aggregated data, even data already broken down by basic racial categories. And what this is even thinking about, you all, and this quote has really challenged me a bit sometimes, because as a public health researcher and in American society, had a long history of categorizing data by racial categories, of clumping a whole group of people together, not recognizing the breadth of diversity amongst that one group. And when you do that, it makes it seem like all the people underneath that category are similar. And so this particular data set is even challenging the fact that we group people together by racial categories, and that a lot of times that masks all types of other variances that's happening within a community in particular. So it's a very interesting thing to think about, and something really to unpack more. The last component of literacy has to do with how we communicate with data, right? Because we read it, we work with it, we use data for the purpose of sharing information with other people. I think it's always important to remember, just like when we're reading data, that when we are taking data and sharing back to our communities, our stakeholders, our grantors, that we should be saying that there is uncertainty in the data. We should be thinking about the places that were missed or things that we didn't collect fully, right? So that we're presenting our data from an ethical way, which I always call just responsible sharing, really thinking about how you collected data. What were your methods? How many people did you collect, right? Something that I find fascinating often is I've seen where a community may have their data saying they researched, and collected data from the ninth and 12th grade classes. And that class group is like 5,000 students, yet their data set is 300 people. I draw a challenge with that. Especially if you haven't communicated that this 300 is out of a pool of 5,000, and then you're making pretty big statements about what you think the data is saying. I think it's always very, very responsible of us to really be truly honest about those limitations when they happen, because they do. We have a goal and sometimes we don't quite reach it. And I think it's always important to say that when we're communicating with data. The thing about communicating with data, you all, is that data tells stories. And one of the best ways we can be more impactful with our data is to think about visualizations. I'm sure many of you have seen data presentations or been to research conferences where your eyes glaze over. You don't even know what you're looking at. There's bars and graphs and charts and numbers and stuff everywhere. And we've got to get better, you all, at how we visualize our data, how we help a community see very quickly what we're trying to say. And so I love this graphic, because if we look from the power of visualizations, we can take the data, we can use narrative and visualizations collectively to create a story that any person, with even someone without a master's or even without an undergrad degree, can pick up and understand, here's what's happening in my community and here's why I need to care. I think data can really offer that as a powerful option to us. So these are the three components that make up data literacy. What I want to leave you all with today is a resource and tool on equity-focused needs assessments. And so this next video we're going to watch actually comes from Tableau and the Urban Institute. They have come together to create a really wonderful guide called Do No Harm, and it's focused on how do we put equity forward and first when we're telling stories with data. I think the video is very well done, so we'll look at it and share this as we begin to close our time today. I hope you find this helpful.
We live in a world that is increasingly defined by data, but how we portray this data impacts the meaning. How would you feel if you were one of the data points in this visualization? The colors, labels, icons, and words we use are critical elements of our data stories. We need to take a closer look to ensure that our data stories consider the context of the incredibly diverse world that we live in. To be fair, to be credible, we must have sensitivity for our subject matter and our audience. We must be intentional and empathetic, guided by the most fundamental principle of all, that data points represent real people. Picture this. Doing good data means doing no harm. As data storytellers in a data-driven world, we have a unique set of responsibilities. To ensure that our analyses are trustworthy, we need to hold data up to close scrutiny. We need to ask hard questions as we gather information and apply rigor in our analyses. The Do No Harm Guide from the Urban Institute addresses the responsibilities we all share in using data responsibly to further the cause of equity in our society. Let's take a deep dive into these 10 recommendations from the Do No Harm Guide and learn how to represent data through a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive lens. Number 1. Critically examine your data. Before you begin your analyses, consider the context of your data. Equity awareness begins with gaining a holistic understanding of the story behind the data. Where do your data come from? Who is included and excluded from it? How was it collected? Why was it collected? And who benefits or who is harmed by these data? Number 2. Use people-first language. If your data is about people, make it extremely clear who they are. Remember that data shown reflect the lives and experiences of real people, and lead with the person, not the characteristic. In visualizations, labels matter. You should strive to use people-first language. Consider people with disabilities instead of disabled people, or people in prison instead of inmate. Number 3. Label people, not skin color. Language is living, breathing, and ever-changing. It's only logical that certain labels that may have been used in the past are no longer acceptable, and may in fact be offensive. In your data analyses, the best approach is to use full labels such as black people, not blacks. Number 4. Labels and their hierarchy have meaning. Who is shown first in a table, graph, or visualization? Order conveys a hierarchy and can influence the way your audience interprets the data. To avoid perpetuating historical biases in the way your data is presented, consider alternative sorting techniques such as study focus, specific story or argument, or quantitative relationship. Alphabetical order or sample size works too. Number 5. Consider missing groups. It's important to acknowledge who is and who is not included in our data and charts. For example, in the United States, many charts on race and ethnicity only show white people, black people, and Hispanic or Latino people, but not other racial or ethnic groups. Charts sometimes only show data in these broader racial groupings, rather than at a more disaggregated level where nuances are more readily understood. Consider adding notes that explain why the data are not inclusive or representative. Number 6. Use color with awareness and care. The way we use color can inadvertently reinforce stereotypes and perpetuate inaccurate depictions of individuals and groups. To use color with the best intent, check your choices. Avoid using colors associated with stereotypical gender labels, pink for women, blue for men, for example. Colors associated with skin tones or race should also be avoided, such as light to dark or incremental color palettes used to indicate different demographic groups. When used appropriately, color is a powerful aid in data visualization. Lacking awareness, we risk creating misperceptions and offending our audiences. Number 7. Consider the impact of icons and shapes. Icons, by their very nature, are intended to convey broad meanings, but they can perpetuate harmful and offensive stereotypes if used carelessly. These elements must be chosen with care. It's essential that any and all stereotypical, discriminatory, and racist imagery is avoided. It's also important that images depict people as empowered and dignified. It's never acceptable to use imagery that depicts people as helpless victims. Number 8. Reach out and connect with the people at the center of your research. To tell relevant and impactful data stories, data communicators need to be empathetic. Building relationships with people and communities that you're researching is fundamental, and maintaining these relationships is just as important. You should do research and analysis with communities, not on behalf of them. Buy-in from members of the community, policymakers, and other stakeholders helps research be more impactful, relevant, and embraced by a wider audience. Number 9. Reflect lived experiences. Not everyone has the same life experience. Our individual characteristics such as ethnicity, gender, and neurodiversity, and age deeply impact the way our research takes shape and form. Consider what your work may be missing and seek out colleagues and communities to help identify them. Number 10. Understand the needs of your audiences. The value of your data lies in how well it can be used, shared, and understood by your intended audiences. As a data communicator, you're responsible for ensuring that your content is clear, unambiguous, and useful to your readers. This requires due diligence across every aspect of your work, striving to ensure that word choices, terminology, and even the languages that you publish in are fully optimized for your audiences and mindful of their needs. As people who are experts in the field of data science and data communication, we're in a position to improve how people view and understand race, ethnicity, and other aspects of identity, and make positive contributions to every aspect of society and culture, from how policies are created to how products are designed and built. We must lead by example, and we must do no harm in our data storytelling. Our point of view should be grounded in principles of equity and fairness. If we fail to do so, we will reinforce damaging stereotypes and mischaracterizations. Or worse, we contribute to the narratives that lead to deeper stigmas and cultural divides. To learn more from leading experts at the intersection of data and equity issues, and to download the complete Do No Harm guide from the Urban Institute, visit the Racial Equity Data Hub.
Okay. So I'll go ahead and just have the Minty up. That way, if folks want to share their thoughts while I chat here a little bit. That video you all just is loaded with so much good stuff to think about. One of the things I do want to provide for you all. Okay, yes, thank you, Glenda. I will put the link to the actual video too in the chat. The link I just put is actually to the report, the full report. But I'll give the link to the video too. So something that I think about, one of the strategies, number 4, and I mention it specifically because I've had multiple people and groups take specifically number 4 and immediately implement it into what they do in their data world. And it's specifically of recognizing how we display data, especially when we're talking about data that's organized by race and ethnicity. Something that I had never noticed before is that the standard in data is to put white first and then all the other people. I mean, almost any data set you look at, it's there. I did a quick just look here, Kaiser Family Foundation, went to just look at population demographics, and no matter what state you choose, it's white first, and there's no necessary rhyme or reason around it, except for that's the standard that has been placed in society. And so one of the most profound things that I immediately started doing when I do data is when I look up data now, I organize it either by increasing order. So if I were to redo this and do a graph, I would do it by increasing order, or I do it alphabetically. Those are the 2 ways I do it. It depends on the visualization I'm going for. If I want to show a pattern, I might do it in increasing order of the bars, or I'll just choose alphabetically. But this is something that I've seen multiple states now really look at, how we're perpetuating inequity by making white the point of reference or the bar on which everyone else is judged against. And this is just a small thing that can be changed, right? So I know that was a powerful thing that I learned here in thinking about the data equity conversation. Thank you for someone who did thinking about the story you want to tell as a part of presenting the data, right? And this Do No Harm guide, you all will give you plenty of resources on how to kind of do that as you look forward to really, presenting your data in a way that is going to be equitable, and considering that. I was just going to grab the link here for the chat real quick, and then just to open up the room for a minute, if folks have thoughts or conversations or anything people want to share, you can either by voice, we only got 4 minutes left, you can either drop it in the Minty, or if anyone wanted to come off mute and just share any closing thoughts on the content from today. Okay, and then I just grabbed the link here for that video. So I'll drop that in the chat for you all also. And then of course, if you all have the digital workbook, in the workbook, if you have the digital version, when you see the image, if you click on it, it'll take you right to the video, okay? So I encourage you all, as you all move out into your communities and doing your work, ask more why, think about how you're presenting your data, really gain a level of consciousness here, because this is a place of power that we have the ability to change and make a difference on.